Hi, welcome into our May Lunch and Learn session, where today we'll be talking about forming habits to work smarter, not harder. Being successful with Hubly requires changing your habits a lot of the time. Specifically, how do you work with your team? In this Lunch and Learn, we're going to dive into the three most common work processes and explore how they evolve with Hubly. So you come out of a client review. Where do you go? What do you do? You get assigned a meeting follow-up task. Where do you go? What do you do? You're handing off a workflow to another team member. What do you do? How do you prepare that for them? We're going to be covering these three instances today over the next 30 to 45 minutes during this Lunch and Learn. So let's move on. I'll give you a little rundown of the agenda. So we'll start off with a speaker introduction, and then we'll move on to building habits around your workflows. We'll be looking at this through this perspective of the advisor, through the perspective of the client associate, and then finally with the whole team. So for a little speaker introduction here, if you don't know me, my name is Olivia. I'm the community and support manager here at Hubly. I'll be live on the chat throughout this webinar, answering any questions that come up, and I'll also be facilitating a Q&A at the end of the Lunch and Learn today. So any questions that you have, you can pop them in there and we'll get them answered. And then leading this Lunch and Learn today is Ron Gordetsky. He's Hubly's co-founder and COO, absolute expert on everything that Hubly has to offer. So let's get into it.
Thanks, Olivia. I wouldn't say expert just yet, but really excited for everyone to join us today for this Lunch and Learn. As Liv already mentioned, basically, we're going to be covering really those habits that we've seen many of the most successful users and the most successful advisory firms form and evolve as a result of really building their work structures out a certain way and really basically forcing change amongst how they work to stop what you see on your screen here, which is a flurry of sticky notes, spreadsheets, whiteboards, notepads, and unrelated tasks floating around your different software, and really creating those workflow structures that help you create the structure to work within. This better structure, we found at least, really helps firms reduce repetition, redundancy, increase visibility over your work, and ideally keep things from slipping through the cracks, especially as your business grows, as your team grows, and as people go on vacation, go to conferences, and the world kind of reopens. You really want to make sure that the habits that you form today are going to be ones that help your business succeed in the long run. Workflows on their own won't necessarily help you work better. So today, we're going to be talking about the habits that you build to help plug your work into Hubly workflows and really create that single source of truth that will help you stay focused and on track. There are, of course, going to be different starting points depending on different roles on your team. If you're a solo advisor, then think of yourself as playing those different roles depending on the kind of work that you're going to be doing. If you're part of a team, then really for each user, there might be a slightly different habit that you build because everyone's role and structures are going to be a little bit different. But it's important for your team to know what you do so that they can know where they should look, and especially where they should look for work that you're going to pass over to them. For many of you, this might have been a little bit of what your life looked like before Hubly. Maybe you had a few more monitors, maybe a whiteboard in the background, but really there were a lot of different places that we know you look to build that source of truth about where things are at for your clients. As you're all financial advisory firms, we're going to start off today focusing on the role of the advisor. In this case, the goal is really to for the advisors to identify where your work comes from. And this is pretty unique to your role. Your phone calls, your emails, your client review meetings, your introductory calls with the new prospects really impact how your day will run, what your team will do, and will drive you in the first few minutes when you get into Hubly in terms of where you look and where you record the information. So if your work comes directly from the client, you really are going to find yourself working reactively to document your client's needs in Hubly. So the first thing we're going to do today when we jump into Hubly, we're going to identify where do you go, as Olivia mentioned, and what do you do? And then it's going to be your job collectively to try to build those habits within your business to reinforce those behaviors and to basically change course so that your habit isn't to jot something down in a sticky note or record something down in a notepad. It's actually to go in and do what we're going to do in a second here. So for those of you who are Hubly users, I do encourage you as always to follow along. I know you might have your hands full with your lunch, so that's totally okay as well. You can replay this recording later on and follow along on your screen after the fact. But if you do have a browser in front of you, and if you are a Hubly user, you can pop open a new tab and navigate to app.myhubly.com, or just flip to Hubly if it's already open in your browser like it is for me. So really focusing on that advisor's journey. Since your work is at this point coming from maybe an email that you receive from a client or a phone call, or in this case, let's say that you're coming out of that review meeting. The simplest place to go to really start your interaction in Hubly with your client, with your workflows, is that contact menu. Really recognizing that this is the quickest way to go in and find the client that you just met with is important because it keeps you from clicking around and potentially getting distracted with something that is unrelated, as we all tend to do when we go into our email inbox, trying to find that one email, then suddenly we're replying to 3 others that we weren't looking for. So really keeping yourself focused and on track by looking for that client and opening up their client card. Doing so, the first place I typically look is on the right-hand side of that client card, because this area shows me what is currently in progress for that client. Especially if I work with a team, it's important to see what is everybody else working on? Where do they lead this client? And so in this case, I'm looking at that client review preparation. It makes sense because I just walked out of the client review meeting. So a little bit, I kind of know now that I'm in the right place. So the client review preparation in my case is that workflow right before that meeting happens. In my case, I can see that I completed a couple of tasks and so did my team. I can see when those tasks were completed. And you know what? The prep is already over with, so I'm just going to go ahead and move that client into the meeting topics workflow. I just had this meeting, so it actually makes it easy for me to check off what I talked about. Maybe we reviewed their fee this time around. It was their 12-month meeting. And then let's see, right now it's the May-June meeting, so we're probably reviewing our insurance needs at this time of year. And they're probably doing a little bit of travel, so we might have looked at a little bit about that, and then adjusted their savings plan because the client's income changed in the first half of this year. Setting up your workflows here in such a way that it makes it really easy for you to basically guide yourself through that checklist of the different topics that you know you might have covered. It's going to help you look back and help your team look back and see what was discussed, just to avoid any confusion. Now, in Hubly, of course, you're also able to add additional things you discussed if they weren't already listed within that workflow. It makes it really easy just to customize that workflow with additional topics that might be not as common, because maybe there's a baby's on the way and you might have discussed that. Just as an example. In this case, though, I'm going to go ahead and mark that meeting topics completed. I've documented what I talked about. I'm going to leave it right there. And I'm actually going to go in and start that follow-up workflow. So again, looking at the right-hand side, my habit is here again, just to spend 5 minutes after a meeting document what we talked about, and then leave off the next steps for either myself to come back to if you're a solo advisor, or to pass that over to your team. So for that reason, I have a client review follow-up workflow. It comes right after my client review meeting topics. And so that follow-up here prompts me to do a couple of things. First and foremost, to save my meeting notes. Luckily, I record those in a different application. I just use a notepad for that, which I type all my notes into. So I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to copy those notes. And I'm going to make sure they're documented as a comment in Hubly. And that's going to save them back as a note into my CRM. So and I might just go ahead and just paste them into here. Now, this is the first step that's really important, whether you're coming from a review meeting or you just got a client phone call. Documenting your notes and keeping them in that client card so they're both in Hubly and in your CRM is going to be important steps, that you're not recording those in a Slack message or a Teams message or an email, not only because, well, that information can accidentally get out because it's not as secure, but also because when your team needs it, they might not look in Slack or Teams. They might look in that client record in CRM or in Hubly, and really being able to see that in one place is super, super important. So again, working toward that single source of truth always. Well, in this case, I've done recording my meeting notes. I'm going to go ahead and check that task off because I finished it. And again, anybody else that comes into Hubly can now see that there are notes associated with that task. They can click on it and scroll, and Hubly will scroll you down to find those notes right there. Now, at this point, you can just leave this as it is. So if you are dealing with a high volume of clients or a high volume of just meetings in that day, and you have a team that's going to really help you review those notes, break them apart into follow-up tasks, and then basically get to work, then at this point, Hubly makes it really easy to pass that work off to your support staff. In this case, I'm going to select all the unassigned tasks in this workflow, and I'm going to go ahead and select Hubly support and hit save. Now, we're going to leave this example here, but we're going to come back to this on the next part of this Lunch and Learn, which is going to be really around what this looks like from your team's perspective. Now, if you're meeting with a different client, or maybe you had a phone call, it's not quite a meeting, you can also start off in the client card. And you can do one of a few things. You can add the client directly to a workflow by selecting that Assign to Workflow button on the client card. And in my case, I'm just going to drop this client into miscellaneous to-dos, because I'm going to assume that maybe I don't actually have a workflow for the item that came out of this call. But if you did have a workflow, then you could have also started the client directly in the workflow. So for example, if Robert gave you a phone call and he has an urgent need for cash, so it's going to trigger distribution, you can go ahead and either record that need as a miscellaneous to-do. So again, you have it in one place, and maybe in this case, it's going to be the task going to be record notes from a phone call. And you can again go ahead and document those notes as a comment on that client card. Or if your hub is already built out and you know the exact workflow that Robert would need to start in, you'd be able to just go, instead of adding to miscellaneous to-dos, so you'd be able to go and add them directly into a cash disbursement. So again, setting up your workflows in such a way that allows you to very quickly launch a workflow based on a client's need is important. You might not have all the workflows in place, but starting in the client card allows you to focus on just that client and either find the appropriate workflow for the request, or document the request in the miscellaneous to-dos workflow, where you can record the notes and assign a follow-up step to somebody else. Now, let's say that we do that. This client has a distribution need. We recorded that need. We check this task off, and we're going to go ahead and create a task for process disbursement. We're going to assign that to my team member here, and we're going to go ahead and hit save. So the most important part of this habit is starting the habit by focusing in on the client, and then either adding and documenting the follow-up steps in one of the active workflows if they're already a part of that process and you're just moving that process along, or launching the client into a workflow where you can document the conversation and set in motion the request that came in. Now, as a client associate or support staff, if that's your role in your firm, or again, if you're solo advisor and you're wearing many different hats, then when you're basically in that role of following up and identifying those requests, then your interactions with Hubly change a little bit. The habits that you build are going to be unique to your role, as well as unique to the specific area or areas of the business that you're overseeing or you're responsible for. So for most of you who are client associates or support staff, your work starts from the advisor, and you may have follow-up tasks to complete, documents to request or prepare, email follow-up to send, and this may already be captured as a task in a workflow for that client, or it might be captured as meeting notes in the client card. So it's important basically to be able to identify in Hubly what needs your attention, what's assigned to you, what's overdue, what's coming up. So building those habits slightly differently than the advisors is going to allow you to have a bit of a broader picture of your work than just specific to one individual client. Now, of course, if maybe they sent you an email or Slack, or they just yelled across the office that, hey, there's an urgent request for such and such client, your work might start in the client card, just like the advisors did. Or if you're answering an email from a client that's following up on a request, then again, your work might also start in that client's card. But today we're going to focus on the other use case, which is that your work is generated by the advisor who's captured it and either launched it in a workflow or captured it as a follow-up step. And now your question is, where do you go and what do you do? So if this is your role, again, follow me into Hubly, and we're gonna explore those habits as well. Perfect. So the habits that you build when you start your day in Hubly are going to be a little bit different, again, based on your role and the areas of the business that you're responsible for. Now, because these habits are contingent on somebody else in your business, in this case, the advisor, it's important to actually discuss and agree upon where that work is going to be left. Because if you decide that the advisor is always going to start off work, for example, in the meeting follow-up workflow for you, that's going to be one of the places, then you're probably going to want to search for and select that client review follow-up workflow so that you always have it on your screen. So really agreeing upon where that handoff is going to happen is super important to have as you build to start your day. When you're just getting up and running in Hubly, then you might decide that for meetings, it's going to be a client review follow-up workflow. If the client calls in or emails and somebody else picks up and answers, then that work's going to be handed over in the client call or email follow-up. And for everything that kind of is in between then we're going to use the miscellaneous to-dos workflow. So just like I did, you would want to go in and you'd actually want to search through and find those different workflows and pick them out of your workflow library. This way, you've kind of limited your dashboard to these 3 different workflows that you know a new client will often be added into, and the next task is often going to be one that needs your attention. In this case, we can see Elizabeth, the fictional client that we just met with as the advisor, and she's in the client review follow-up. We can also see that we looked at Robert Jones, and he has that process disbursement that we just talked about. So this makes it really easy to see a summary of all the clients that are in those workflows that you know are typically causing kind of downstream work for you. It also makes it easy to see which clients have tasks that are overdue in that case. What we recommend doing is filtering this down. And you can use the assignees filter to be able to see just the work that's assigned to you, for example. But also, if you know that you're still getting started and maybe not every task that needs your attention is assigned to you, you might not want to apply that filter yet, so that you see that high-level overview, and then you're able to click through and see, well, sure enough, I forgot to assign, as the advisor, I forgot to assign the rest of these tasks to my team member. So in that case, you can go ahead and assign them to yourself. Hubly makes it really easy in this case to save this layout into a starting view for yourself. Starting view or a view is really like bookmarking your favorite layout of your screen. So in this case, we're going to say, these are all of my follow-up workflows. So all follow-up workflows. And give it a color, we could even give a description, basically, if we wanted to, again, add a little bit of detail to this bookmark layout of the hub. This makes it so that you don't have to look for those workflows every time. And you can quickly just go into your views. And in this case, my follow-up workflow is the very bottom. So I'm just going to move them up to the very top so I can build that habit around going into Hubly and starting my day by looking at this one area where I know is going to trigger some work for me. Now, when you go through the workflow, it might trigger, for example, that next step, which is to process a disbursement. And so in this case, you might already have a workflow to process that disbursement. So I know that we found that workflow by going into the Add Workflow menu as the advisor and adding the client in. But you can also find that workflow by going Clear All, so you exit that starting view. And then you can go down and just search for an appropriate workflow or a workflow template if you're still getting set up for that activity that needs to happen. Now, in this case, Robert's already been added. If Robert hadn't been added before, you can, before adding a client, you can always review to make sure that you're happy with the layout of that workflow. So it makes sense for you, especially if it's a workflow you haven't personally used before. And we're going to talk about planning your workflows to actually hand tasks over from one person to the other in a second. That's going to be something that we talk about in a moment here. But in this case, this allows you to begin that disbursement process by adding the client into the workflow. So by going to Add Client menu. And then hopefully in that miscellaneous to-dos, the advisor recorded that comment to basically give you the instructions of what the disbursement needs to look like. Now, as your hub develops, your habits will evolve as well. So it's important to continue to revisit your starting point based on the workflows that you have really put in place by that point. And so what I mean by that is that if your responsibilities cover all of your investment workflows, then once you have built out the investment workflows to work the way that you want them to, and I say you as a firm. So you'd be working on this with the advisor, with anybody else in your team that's responsible for the activities in the investment grouping of workflows. And once these work the way that everyone's comfortable with and they support the process that they're meant to support, then it's important to incorporate that into your starting routine. Because instead of adding clients into miscellaneous to-dos, for example, somebody that gets off a client call or reviews a client email could just tee up, for example, Robert, directly in that investment cash disbursement workflow. And that's really to save you time. So you don't have to go to miscellaneous to-dos, document it there, then hand it over to you, and then you'd go in and then review the miscellaneous to-dos and start them in cash disbursement. So the advisor might just go find the cash disbursement workflow, add Robert in, and then document what needs to happen on that very first task. So that's why it's important. And in the next phase of this lunch and learn, we're going to actually cover working together as a team. And so as a team, it's important to work together to plan out your workflows, review your workflows, and develop the different habits to support each of your roles. You're going to oftentimes need to agree upon and revisit the flow of workflow steps to best support how you want to work with one another. It's important to be transparent and intentional in developing and communicating those habits so that as a team, you build a routine and you're on the same page as to where to go in Hubly to find that work. And so we recommend to work together on this. So review your key routines, talk about where different types of work gets generated and recorded, and then make adjustments to create stronger handoffs between the person capturing the to-do and the person who needs that to-do to be brought to their attention. We recommend setting time aside regularly, weekly if you're just getting started with Hubly, monthly if you've been in for a couple of quarters, and at least once a quarter if you're happy with the structures. But of course, things change, so it's important to still give that time to revisit in a quarterly Hub review. You can also incorporate reviews into your existing all hands or create separate 15 to 30-minute calls as needed. So if there's a new process that needs to be established or something isn't quite working because you notice a client is slipping through the cracks, it's important to identify that in an all hands meeting and then immediately schedule a quick follow-up between the parties that are responsible for that handoff just to fix the habits associated with it. So going back into Hubly, what that means is really thinking about and being intentional around where the person capturing the work is going to go. And then again, what they're going to do once they actually get there. So if the person capturing the work is again the advisor, they might be capturing it in a workflow specific to that activity that got triggered, like a cash disbursement. So when planning a cash disbursement workflow, it's important to give them a place to capture the instructions prior to passing it along to the next person in the workflow. So that first step to prepare the paperwork might not make as much sense as a first step that says capture instructions or disbursement instructions. On that first step, you can either leave a comment again, which is going to sync back in as a note to your CRM, or you can use the description section to make sure that you cover all the bases that somebody on your team is going to need to know to process that disbursement. Some of the common ones might be amounts, accounts, tax withholdings, maybe some other notes too. You can capture that information right here. And then that makes it easy for whoever you assign the workflow to come in and be able to quickly see those instructions that you documented when you handed off that cash disbursement workflow. Next, it's important to remember to assign and to delegate the appropriate steps to whoever else is going to be responsible. You might still want to be responsible for a couple of steps in here. Maybe you want to be the one that verifies a trade, as you do need to sign off. So you can keep yourself assigned to that one task. But for the rest of them, you can quickly reassign them over to whoever on your team is going to be responsible for those steps. Now, creating that strong handoff, one part is having that easy to access place to see the instructions and seeing who recorded the instructions and when. Now, to make that even stronger, you can go ahead and we recommend setting a reminder to bring it to that person's attention on the timeline that you want it to be brought to their attention. So that's a disbursement that can wait until next week or maybe until the end of this month. You can schedule that reminder for a little bit further into the future. If that's something that really just needs to happen as soon as possible, typically it is, you can use that later today function to just throw it into the schedule for later on today. And that way, when your team member comes into Hubly, they're going to see that this cash disbursement workflow is already coming due today. And in their Hub feed, they're also going to be able to see that they have some work that's currently waiting for them. So for them, they're going to load up and they're going to be able to see that they have one task that's about to come due. And that's for the client in the cash disbursement workflow that we're just working in. Now, once you have built that and tried that habit out for the first time, it's important to go in and update the workflow so that that becomes something that you do every time. So in this case, we'd go in here, we'd add a task called disbursement instructions. We place it where we want it to go. And we can even go ahead and make a template for the task details so that every time when somebody is added to that workflow, you have the same fields to fill out. We can also pre-assign that task that needs to come back to you. So for example, if you're going to be verifying a trade, every time you can pre-assign that task to yourself. And of course, you can set a reminder to automatically trigger for that handover step. And it's important to think about all of those different handovers and workflows and to ensure that A, the person receiving the step is urgent. And to do that in Hubly, you can add a reminder to only trigger when the task before it completes. And again, you can either set it to trigger immediately. In this case, it is probably going to be an immediate handoff. Or you can set it to trigger after a couple of days, weeks, months, or hours. Hubly makes it very flexible to basically allow you to set that urgency in the handoff so that you can ensure that at one point, that task will be brought to the next person's attention, either in the Hub feed or inside of the workflow itself, by seeing that workflow come overdue and that next task have that reminder. So in this case, we're going to say immediate. We're going to hit add. And now the next person that we go ahead and add into this workflow, let's say that Charles needs a disbursement now. We're going to drop Charles in. There he is. Well, that first task and the verify trade task are pre-assigned to me. The instruction task has a template for the instructions already here. So I can go ahead and I can just edit the task details and record the information that the next person is going to need. Hit complete, and you see that that next task immediately has a reminder, even before I've had a chance to assign it to the person on my team that's going to do it for me. So all I need to remember to do now is to assign that workflow or the rest of the steps to that person if I work on a team with many people. If I only work on a team with one other or two other people and the responsibilities are clearly defined, then of course I can pre-assign those tasks just as I pre-assigned my own tasks in this workflow. So it's not hard to reinforce the habits that you build. Habit really tries to make it intuitive and easy. It's just important to be intentional in building workflows and then driving your habits to drive the work into your workflows. There is a light at the end of the tunnel, and it's something that gets easier and easier as you reinforce it, as you go in and you iterate your workflows, as we just did, and you make them better to help your team work more efficiently together. We've seen it work many times, and that's really what our team is here to help you with. So if after this lunch and learn, you have any questions, or if you just want a hand setting up that next handover or configuring that view for a starting point. Your starting point might be the follow-up workflows, or it might be your trade workflows or your tax workflows, depending on the area of the business that you're responsible for. You can message us in the chat in Hubly. If you're not a client yet, you can give us a message and book a strategy call at myhubly.com. Apologize for the background noise here. It seems that my fire alarm is being tested. And we'd be happy to discuss your challenges that you're facing in your business and really help you see how we can work together to either build out better structures for your workflows in Hubly, or have you join our community onboarding, where we can start you off with a lot of our best practice templates and really help you refine those to reinforce and build those habits that help you work together as an individual advisor or with your team. I will pause there. If anybody has any questions that have been unanswered, Liv, I'll let you bring those up and we can go and review them.
Yeah, for sure. So we've got one question that did just pop up, just a little clarification. I'm wondering, Ron, if you can talk a little bit about why sometimes you would be, kind of assigning tasks in the moment, and the difference between, assigning tasks in the moment and then templated workflows with those pre-assigned tasks.
Yeah, for sure. So that's a really great question. You might, a lot of the times when you're just getting out of a meeting or out of a client call, or you have that email come in that you want to capture the work that has just come in, oftentimes it might be easier for you to start off by capturing that as a note in that client's record. So for example, in this case, where we were in a client card for the client meeting follow-up, and maybe you have your notes captured already in that case, it might be easier to paste that in as a note in Hubly, which is going to sync in to your CRM as well. And then that creates the handover for somebody in your team to come in, get up to speed with what happened in that meeting, review the action items that came out of that meeting, and then go in and plug that work into the workflows that they're most familiar with. Oftentimes for advisors, we hear that your time is very limited, you're running between meetings, and you want as easy and as simple of a handoff as possible. And so that's really what this creates for you. And again, you might be using the client review follow-up workflow, or you might be recording that as a miscellaneous to-do and assigning to somebody else on your team to go and add to the right and appropriate workflow. But it creates one simple handoff for you, as opposed to having to really be as adept with the workflows in your hub as your operations team might be, who's really helping you keep all that work flowing and on track. So we try to keep it simple for the advisor so that you don't feel like you need to spend all that much time getting the right client in the right workflow and following all the nuanced steps. Now, that said, for smaller firms or for solo advisors, you might not have that privilege. You might be the one documenting the to-dos and the one executing the trade or the disbursement or the beneficiary update. So for you, you can skip that middle step. If you're only handing it over to yourself, or if you're going to be responsible for the downstream work that it generates, you can go directly into the workflow that needs that attention because you're familiar with that predefined work. So again, when we go into that cash disbursement workflow here, since you're familiar with it, you don't really need to capture that as a to-do or as a follow-up item separate of starting the workflow. So it really depends on that team dynamic and how that team is really built out, and whether the advisor, you're trying to capture that in and move on to the next meeting, you have limited time, or you're on the same page with everybody else in your team, you know exactly how your workflows are built out, and you might even have a role in the execution of that work downstream. So we try to keep it as simple as possible to get started, simply by having that single source of truth where you capture the work. And then as you go out and build the work structures to support those tasks, you can decide where you start that work. But for you, the habit will still be to start in that client card and then either find the appropriate workflow to add the client into, or capture that to do in a workflow that they're already in, or a simple follow-up workflow. Good question, Luke. Any other questions that were brought up there?
Oh yeah, one more just actually popped in. If there's a note that's added to a task, where is the note stored so other team members can see that? I don't know, Rung, you can speak to that, or I can. You can.
Yeah, for sure. So we talked about two different ways to record information on task. We talked about a cash disbursement workflow, how we created that template for the task details. And so if somebody goes in and records that information, again, let's say that this client only needs 15,000, say account ending, and maybe that's all the information that you record. Well, that is stored within the Hubly workflow, within that task. And it's available just by clicking on to that little paragraph icon that is pre-filled next to the task's name. Now there is also the comment. So I know that we talked about after the client meeting there, we recorded our notes as a comment. And so when you record a note, when you record any information as that comment, it's recorded separate of that task, although you can still link to it. Just by clicking on that comment, it's going to scroll you down and find the comment at the bottom of your card. Now, the reason that comments are separate from the descriptions is because comments also sync into Wealthbox or Redtail, so whichever CRM you use. So some firms prefer to use comments because they are more visible, and they're also synced into that separate record. And depending on the CRM you use, some comments are uneditable, meaning that once you've made them, they're part of the permanent record. So those are really the two areas. Comments live as notes in your CRM, and these descriptions, well, they live right under that task. Good question. Awesome. Well, not seeing any other questions in the chat unless there are any, Liv, that you want to bring to my attention.
Nope, I think that's all I have so far. Yeah.
Perfect. I would love to open up the floor for any suggestions for any future topics that you would like us to cover on Lunch and Learns in this format. So you can post those in the chat. And I did see that final question come in from one of our attendees. And the question is that once a task is marked completed, basically, can you still go back and look at it? And the answer is yes. So in Hubly, any and all record for client service, which you record as descriptions or tasks, once you complete them, they're going to be stored inside of that client's card. So you really form a service record that allows you to see exactly what your team did, who did the different steps, and then when they were marked completed as well. You can also edit it, yes. So if you needed to go back and if it was marked completed accidentally, or if the task just needs some additional details, you can go back and you can also edit those completed tasks. You can also uncomplete them, and that will remove that completion timestamp as well until you mark that workflow complete. So. Awesome. Awesome. Thank you for the suggestions. I do see those coming in, and we're going to be hopefully building some more content as we as we take a look at the topics that you'd like to hear about. Just want to say a quick thank you to everyone for spending your lunch with me today. We're going to wrap it up here, give you a couple more minutes before the hour here to finish up your food if you're on the East Coast, or have another coffee if you're on the West. And yeah, again, thank you for attending, and please do reach out to us if you're a Hubly user in the chat. And if you're not, feel free to schedule a strategy call at myhubly.com. Have a great day, everyone.